Before we start, just a reminder, if you enjoy this kind of content, subscribe to the channel. Now let's get to the video. The sun hung low and bruised over the Arizona territory, painting the distant saguaros in shades of deep orange and purple. Dust, finest flowered and constant as time itself, swirled around Silas Blackwood's boots as he dismounted his Bay Mare lady outside the general store in Redemption Creek. At 40 years old, Silas's face was etched with the lines of sun and wind, his hands calloused from years of working a small cattle ranch out in the isolation of the Painted Hills. He was a man of few words, known more for the quiet efficiency of his work than for any grand pronouncements or boisterous laughter. Silas was also, though no one in Redemption Creek knew it for certain, a virgin. It wasn't for lack of opportunity, not entirely. There were women in town, some looking for a husband, some for a temporary comfort. But Silas had always felt a chasm between himself and others, a quiet awkwardness that made small talk feel like a monumental task and intimate gestures an impossible leap. He spent his youth focused on surviving, on making a life out of barren land, and somewhere along the way, the idea of courtship had slipped through his fingers like grains of sand. He'd never found a woman who made his tongue untie, or his heart truly sing, and he certainly wasn't the kind to seek out fleeting physical comfort. So, he remained in his silent, solitary world, with only Lady and his herd for company. Today, however, the dust in the air felt different, charged with a subtle current that hummed beneath his skin. It had been like this for the past few months, ever since she arrived. Evelyn Hayes. She ran the saloon now, the dusty old watering hole that had always been the town's heart, though often a troubled one after the previous owner, a grizzled prospector, had finally drunk himself into an early grave. Evelyn had appeared out of nowhere, a vision of composure and quiet strength. She bought the place, refurbished it with a woman's touch, clean windows, fresh paint, and a subtle scent of lilac that somehow clung to the rough-hewn wood. She didn't serve liquor herself, preferring to hire a burly bartender, and she kept the rowdiness to a minimum with a glance that could silence the loudest brawler. Silas had first seen her through the saloon's newly cleaned window, catching a glimpse of her as she directed a delivery. Her hair, the color of polished mahogany, was always impeccably pinned up. No loose strands despite the heat. Her dresses, though simple, were always neat, complementing a figure that was both elegant and undeniably robust from hard work. She carried herself with an air of dignified independence that both fascinated and intimidated him. He usually avoided the saloon, preferring to get his supplies from the general store and head straight back to his ranch. But lately, he'd found himself lingering, inventing reasons to be in town on certain days, just for the chance to see her, to catch the faint scent of lilac that seemed to follow her. He finished tying Lady to the hitching post, adjusting his worn saddlebag. As it turned, he saw her, stepping out of the saloon's swinging doors, a small ledger in her hand. She was talking to Jebediah, the grizzled old blacksmith, her voice a low, melodic murmur that carried even over the clang of Jebediah's hammer. Silas's gaze nagged on her profile, the strong line of her jaw, the way the light caught the few silvery threads in her dark hair. She wasn't young, perhaps in her mid-30s, but her beauty was mature, weathered by life but not diminished. It was in the quiet confidence of her movements, the intelligent spark in her eyes, the very aura of self-possession that surrounded her. She's a sight, and Jebediah's voice rumbled, pulling Silas from his reverie. The blacksmith had walked over, wiping sweat from his brow with a greasy rag. He followed Silas's lingering gaze to where Evelyn was now walking towards the general store. Silas cleared his throat, feeling a flush creep up his neck. He hadn't realized his admiration was so transparent. She's efficient, he managed, trying to sound nonchalant. It was a poor lie, even to his own ears. Jebediah chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Efficient, aye, and then some. Never thought I'd see that old saloon cleaned up right, and she ain't afraid of a rough word or two if need be. Here tells some drifters tried to cause trouble last week, and she just walked right up, stared 'em down with them eyes, and they backed off faster than a rattlesnake in a fire. Smart too. Got that ledger open all the time, knows her numbers. Silas listened, trained to appear casual, as he adjusted the bridle on Lady. He felt a familiar note of inadequacy tighten in his chest. What would a woman like Evelyn Hayes, so capable and self-assured, ever see in a man like him? A 40-year-old rancher who barely spoke 2 words to a stranger, whose hands were more comfortable with a lasso than with a lady's. She's got a good way about her, Silas admitted, the words coming out in a low mumble. A focus on a loose buckle on Lady's rein, avoiding Gebediah's knowing gaze. Gebediah leaned in conspiratory, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. You know, Silas, folks around here are starting to wonder about her. She has been here a few months now, runs a tight ship, but she keeps to herself, mostly. No gentleman callers, not a one. Some say she's a widow, some say she never had a man, quiet. Like you, maybe, he trailed off, a hint of a grin playing on his weathered face. Silas stiffened, his ears burning. He knew what Gebediah was implying. The unspoken rumors, the small-town gossip that picked apart every newcomer. He found himself defending her, though she was unaware of it. It's a hard life out here, Gebediah. A woman's got to protect herself. Can't blame her for keeping her guard up. Gebediah just grunted, a knowing glint in his eye. Indeed. Well, I best get back to my forge. Got a wagon wheel needs mending. He clapped Silas on the shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie that felt oddly heavy today. You have a good ride back, Silas. Silas watched him go, then turned his attention back to Evelyn. She was standing by the entrance of the general store now, looking over some barrels of flour with Mr. Henderson, the store owner. The sun caught her hair, turning it to liquid amber. Her profile was sharp, defined, and even from this distance, Silas felt the magnetic pull of her presence, a quiet power that drew him in despite his overwhelming shyness. She's so hot, he admitted, the words barely a whisper, meant only for himself. A raw, honest assessment that escaped his lips before he could censor it. He looked it down, embarrassed even by his own private thought, fiddling with the buckle on Lady's rein, as if it were the most complicated mechanism in the world. He felt the blast spread from his neck to his ears, a sure sign of his discomfort. He was still looking down, contemplating the scuff marks on his boots, when a voice, clear and surprisingly close, cut through the sounds of the buzzing street. I heard that, Mr. Blackwood. Silas's head shot up. Evelyn Hayes stood before him, not 3 feet away, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. Her eyes, the color of rich earth, held a glint of amusement, but also something else. Something deeper that he couldn't quite decipher. His heart hammered against his ribs like a panicked Mustang. He felt his face flush even deeper, a burning crimson that he was sure reviled the setting sun. His mind went totally blank, a tumbleweed blowing through an empty desert. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. He wanted to apologize, to explain, to vanish into a cloud of dust. He wanted the earth to swallow him whole. Evelyn's smile softened, becoming more genuine, and a delicate laugh, like the rustle of dry leaves in a gentle breeze, escaped her lips. It was the first time he'd ever heard her laugh, and it was a sound that resonated deep within him, warm and inviting. Don't look so mortified, Mr. Blackwood, she said, her voice surprisingly gentle, stripping away the sharpness of his embarrassment. It's not often a woman hears such a direct compliment around these parts. Usually it's just cruder whistles or leering stares. She paused, her gaze steady, unblinking. Silas found himself trapped in her eyes, unable to look away. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken thoughts. Then she took a small step closer, her voice dropping to a low, almost confidential tone, a whisper meant only for him, pulling him into a circle of intimacy he'd never known. The scent of lilac was stronger now, enveloping him. Her eyes, still holding that unreadable depth, held him. And then she said, very softly, with a hint of challenge and a surprising vulnerability, "Be my first." Silas's mind, which had moments earlier been a chaotic whirlwind of mortification, now simply froze. The world narrowed to the woman standing before him, her words echoing in the sudden profound silence between them. "Be my first." The phrase was a riddle wrapped in an impossible proposition, shattering the carefully constructed walls of his solitary existence. He stared at her, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. The initial embarrassment of his overheard comment had vanished, replaced by a shock so profound it rendered him utterly speechless. His first thought was that he had misheard, that the dust and the fading light had twisted her words into something so utterly preposterous. Evelyn, seeing the bewildered confusion on his face, offered a faint, almost shy smile. "You look as if I've asked you to tame a wild mustang with a feather, Mr. Blackwood," she murmured, her voice still low, almost teasing. But there was no malice in it, only a surprising gentleness. He finally found his voice, a rusty, croaking sound. My apologies, ma'am. I didn't mean to. I shouldn't have." He stumbled over his words, the usual eloquence of his thoughts trapped behind a sudden, insurmountable wall of awkwardness. She waved a dismissive hand. "No need for apologies. It was a compliment, Mr. Blackwood, and as I said, a welcome one. My offer stands." Her gaze was steady, unwavering, challenging him to understand. "Perhaps I should explain myself." Silas could only nod, his throat tight. He felt like a deer caught in a hunter's snare, caught between flight and a strange, compelling curiosity. "Imagine you've heard the whispers," Evelyn began, her voice losing its lightness, becoming more somber, "about my past, or lack thereof, as some might believe." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "My family was proper, all money back east. Strict, very strict. He was educated, groomed for a certain kind of life. A life of quiet subservience to a husband chosen for me. A life of social obligations and children, but not love, and certainly not experience." Her eyes held a flicker of something that looked like old pain, or perhaps regret. "He was promised to a man, a suitably matched by my parents' standards. We were to be married last year, but he died of a consumption before the wedding. My parents, they saw it as a sign, a curse. They washed their hands of me, said I was too headstrong, too independent for a proper wife. They gave me a small inheritance and told me to make my own way." She looked around the dusty street of Redemption Creek, then back at Silas. "I came west seeking freedom, to forge my own path. I bought this saloon because it was a respectable business, and I could manage it. I could be independent. I wanted a life where I made my own choices, where I wasn't defined by what others expected of me." She took a deep breath, her gaze searching his, as if looking for understanding, and that includes matters of the heart and body. Silas listened, mesmerized. Her story was not what he had expected. He had imagined a widow, perhaps, or a woman with a past, but a woman of her age, from a refined background, speaking so openly about her inexperience, her virginity. It was as disarming as it was surprising. "I've seen the kind of men who frequent saloons," she continued, a faint distaste in her voice. "The rough ones, the desperate ones, the ones who only want one thing. I've heard the talk about you, Mr. Blackwood. You're different, quiet, honest, respectful. A man of integrity, I believe. You don't look at me like the others. Not with leering eyes, not with cheap hungers. You look as if you see something more." Silas felt a profound blush spread through him again. This time not of shame, but of a strange, dizzying mixture of flattery and disbelief. To be seen, truly seen by her was a revelation. "I've spent my life following rules, Mr. Blackwood," Evelyn said, her voice dropping again to that intimate whisper. "Now, I want to make my own choices, and I want my first true connection to be with a man I can respect, a man who won't treat it as just a transaction, someone who understands Kiet, someone who might be as unfamiliar with these things as I am." The unspoken question hung in the air. Was he too unfamiliar? Her words were so direct, so honest. They cut through all his defenses. It was indeed unfamiliar. Virgin at 40. It was a secret he'd carried with silent shame for decades. And now, this extraordinary woman, standing before him in the dusty street, was not only revealing her own vulnerability, but was also implicitly acknowledging his without a single judgmental word. She wasn't offering a crude invitation. She was proposing a shared journey into the unknown, a journey of mutual discovery. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just the hot woman he had admired from afar, but a brave, lonely soul reaching out, just as lonely as he was, in her own way. Her own way, her vulnerability was disarming, her courage inspiring. His mind, usually so slow to react, worked with surprising speed. This wasn't about cheap thrills or fleeting desire. This was about connection, about two people, outcasts in their own ways, finding something real in a world that often valued only the rough and the ready. This was an invitation to a different kind of life, a life where he might not be so utterly alone. My cabana is small, mamam." Silas finally managed, his voice still hoarse, but gaining a modicum of strength. "And quite a ride out."
He was trying to buy time, to process the enormity of her offer, to find a way to gracefully accept without making a fool of himself. Evelyn's smile widened. A true, radiant smile widened. A true, radiant smile that lit up her face and made his heart skip a beat. "I am well acquainted with the rigors of the frontier, Blackwood, and a small cabin sounds private. I value privacy." She held his gaze, her eyes sparkling with an almost mischievous light. "So, Mr. Blackwood, will you be my first?" The question hung, suspended in the dusty air, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Silas took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the scent of lilac and the dry, earthy smell of the West. He thought of his solitary ranch, his quiet life, the longing he'd often felt, but never dared to articulate. He thought of the 40 years that had passed, leaving him untouched, unexperienced. And he thought of Evelyn, brave and beautiful and unconventional. There was a moment of absolute stillness, a decision point in the trajectory of his life. He could retreat, make excuses, let fear and old habits claim him, or he could step forward into the terrifying, exhilarating unknown. He looked at her, truly saw her, and for the first time in his life, felt a surge of courage that wasn't about facing a wild animal or surviving a harsh winter, but about embracing life. "Yes, ma'am," Silas said, his voice surprisingly firm now, a deep rumble that resonated with newfound conviction. "I will. Just tell me when." Evelyn's smile was his reward, a promise of something tender and profound. "Tonight," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "After the saloon closes, I'll meet you here, at the hitching post. We'll ride out together." Silas felt a tremor run through him, a strange mixture of apprehension and an almost giddy anticipation. He was 40 years old, a virgin, and he was about to embark on the most extraordinary, terrifying, and exhilarating journey of his life, with a woman who saw him for who he was, and offered him a chance at something he'd never dared to dream of. The dust of Redemption Creek suddenly felt less heavy, less isolating, infused with the faint, hopeful scent of lilac. The ride out to Silas's ranch was cloaked in the vast, star-dusted darkness of the desert night. The silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic thud of horses' hooves and the gentle creak of saddle leather.
Evelyn rode the lady, while Silas led on his old reliable buckskin Duke. He hadn't bothered to bring his own mare in, preferring the familiar comfort of Duke for this unprecedented journey. He offered Evelyn the gentlest ride, a small, unspoken gesture of consideration. Silas rode stiffly, his mind a whirlwind of anticipation and an almost unbearable nervousness. 40 years of solitude, of carefully cultivated detachment, were about to be shattered. He found himself replaying their conversation, her bold offer, his halting acceptance. Was he ready for this? Was she, who had never so much as held a woman's hand with intent, was now leading a refined lady to his desolate ranch for an experience he could barely fathom? Evelyn, sensing his tension, finally broke the silence. "You're very quiet, Mr. Blackwood," she murmured, her voice a soft lullaby in the night. Silas cleared his throat. "Always have been, ma'am. Not much for words." "I gather as much," she replied, a hint of amusement in her tone. "But tonight, perhaps words aren't what's most needed." Directness, once again, disarmant him. He felt a blush creep up his neck, even in the darkness. "No, ma'am," he mumbled. Then, after a moment, "Evelyn." "Silas," she returned, her voice gentle, except the simple exchange of names felt like a profound intimacy, a quiet pact under the sprawling desert sky. As they approached the ranch, the silhouette of his small cabin, humble and solitary, emerged against the backdrop of the star-laden sky. A faint light emanated from the window, as Silas had left a lantern burning, a nervous habit he now regretted. It seemed to illuminate his simple life in all its darkness. They dismounted, the horses' soft whickers echoing in the quiet. Silas tended to them first, unburdening them, leading them to the small corral. He was grateful for the familiar routine, something to ground him. Evelyn waited patiently by the cabin door, her silhouette framed by the faint light. When he finally turned to her, his heart was a drum in his chest. "Welcome to my home, Evelyn," he said, his voice a little strained. She nodded, her eyes scanning the humble surroundings. "It's peaceful," she observed, a genuine warmth in her tone. "Simple, honest. Like you." He unlocked the wooden door and ushered her inside. The single room was sparsely furnished. A narrow bed, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a small stove, and a collection of hunting and ranching tools. It was clean, meticulously so, but undeniably rustic. Evelyn walked slowly into the room, her gaze taking everything in. She ran a hand over the smooth, worn surface of the table, then glanced at the small, neatly stacked pile of books on a shelf, mostly almanacs and cattle-raising guides. Her presence filled the small space, somehow making it feel both smaller and infinitely larger. "Would you care for some coffee, Evelyn?" Silas offered, desperate for another task. "Another moment to compose himself. Perhaps later," she said, turning to face him. Her eyes met his, direct and searching. "Silas," her voice was softer now, tinged with a delicate vulnerability. "This is new for both of us." He nodded, unable to speak, his gaze fixed on hers. She took a small, hesitant step towards him. "I want you to know, I'm not here out of desperation or loneliness alone. I am here because there's something about your quiet strength, your honesty, that calls to me. I trust you, Silas, more than I've trusted anyone in a very long time." Her words were a balm to his raw nerves, a gentle hand reaching across the vast chasm of his inexperience. He felt a profound sense of relief, an easing of the knot in his stomach. He wasn't just a nervous Virgin cowboy, he was a man trusted by a remarkable woman. He reached out a hand, slowly, tentatively, as if unsure if she would flinch away. His calloused fingers brushed against her arm, a feather-light touch that sent a jolt through him. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. I don't know what to do, Evelyn," he confessed, the words dambling out, raw and honest. It was perhaps the most vulnerable thing he had ever said. Her hand came up, gently cupping his cheek, her touch surprisingly firm and warm. "Then we learn together, Silas," she whispered, her gaze softening. "We learn together." And then she leaned in, slowly, giving him ample time to pull away, but he didn't. Her lips, soft and hesitant, met his. It was a tentative kiss at first, full of unspoken questions and shared uncertainties. It wasn't a fiery, passionate kiss he'd read about in dim novels, but something far more profound, a quiet, tender exploration, a gentle merging of two solitary souls stepping into uncharted territory. Silas' hands, which had been hanging uselessly at his sides, finally found their way to her waist, pulling her gently closer. He felt the warmth of her body against his, the soft fabric of her dress beneath his fingers. Her lips moved against his, slowly gaining confidence, and he found himself responding, clumsy but earnest. The kiss deepened, a revelation of senses. The scent of lilac filled his nostrils. The taste of her lips, soft and sweet, surprised him. He felt a tremor run through her, mirroring his own. She pulled back slightly, her eyes still locked with his, her breath coming in soft, short gasps. "My first," she whispered again, the words a sacred vow in the quiet of the cabin. Silas could only nod, his own breathing ragged. His heart was no longer hammering with fear, but with a new, exhilarating rhythm, a symphony of discovery. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and gently touched her cheek, tracing the soft line of her jaw. And so, in the isolated quiet of Silas Blackwood's cabin, under the vast indifferent gaze of the deserted stars, two souls, long uninitiated in the complex dance of intimacy, began a quiet revelation. It was a journey of mutual tenderness, of hesitant exploration, where every touch was a question, every breath a shared answer. There were no grand fireworks, no sudden explosions of passion, but a slow burning ember of connection, nurtured by shared vulnerability and a profound, unspoken trust. The virgin cowboy at 40 was no longer just a rancher, but a man discovering the nuanced language of touch and tenderness, guided by a woman as brave and unexperienced as he was, in her own unique way. And in that quiet space, miles from the judgmental eyes of Redemption Creek, two independent spirits found a refuge, not just from the harshness of the world, but within each other. The morning light, soft and golden, filtered through the small, uncurtained window of Silas's cabin, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Evelyn lay beside him, her head resting on his shoulder, her breathing light and Silas was awake, had been for hours, staring at the rough wooden ceiling, his mind reeling. The night had been a blur of revelations, not just physical, but emotional. He had learned the language of touch, the whispered confessions of two souls navigating a deeply personal landscape. There had been no grand passion, but a profound tenderness, a shared vulnerability that was far more intimate than any practiced skill. He was no longer a virgin. The title, once a heavy, silent shame, now felt oddly insignificant. It was not the act itself that transformed him, but the shared experience, the gentle hand of Evelyn Hayes leading him and being led by him into a world neither had known. He felt lighter, more whole, less alone. He shifted, and Evelyn stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at him, a soft, sleepy smile gracing her lips. "Good morning, Silas," she whispered, her voice still husky from sleep. "Morning, Evelyn," he replied, his voice softer than he'd ever known it to be. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. There was an ease between them now, a comfortable silence that spoke volumes. They spent the morning in the cabin, sharing coffee and simple food, talking in hushed tones about their lives, their dreams. Evelyn spoke of her desire to make the saloon a true community hub, a place for honest folk. Silas, usually so guarded, found himself talking about his land, his cattle, the quiet satisfaction of working the earth. They spoke of the loneliness they both carried and the surprising comfort they found in each other's presence. The ride back to Redemption Creek was different. The dawn air was crisp, the light bright, the silence, though still present, was no longer awkward or heavy, but companionable, filled with a new understanding. Silas still rode Duke, and Evelyn lay. As they approached the town, the familiar sounds of wagons, distant hammers, and barking dogs began to filter through the quiet. Evelyn reached out, her hand gently touching his arm. "Thank you, Silas," she said, her voice sincere, "for your honesty, for your gentleness, for everything." Silas turned to her, his gaze steady, no longer shying away. "Thank you, Evelyn," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "For your courage, for trusting me." They reached the saloon. The morning sun was already beginning to beat down on the dusty street. They dismounted, and Silas helped Evelyn down from Lady. For a moment, they stood there bathed in the early light, two figures who had stepped out of the shadows of their pasts. "I have a business to run," Evelyn said, a hint of her usual composure returning. "And you have a ranch to tend." There was an unspoken question in her eyes. "What now?" Silas nodded. "I'll be back in town next week for supplies," he said, the words feeling too mundane for the enormity of what they had just shared. Evelyn smiled, a knowing glint in her eyes. "I'll be here. Perhaps you'll consider staying for supper next time. In the saloon. I make a decent stew." It was an invitation, public and understated, a step towards integrating their private connection into their public lives, however cautiously. Silas felt a warmth spread through him. "I'd like that, Evelyn, very much." He watched as she turned and walked towards the saloon doors, her step light, her shoulders square. She glanced back once, offering him a small, private smile that carried the weight of their shared secret, their shared revelation. Then she disappeared inside. Silas remonted Duke, anew sprinting his step. He still felt a bit dazed, but it was a pleasant disorientation. The dust of Redemption Creek still swirled, the sun still beat down, and the challenges of the frontier still loomed, but something inside him had fundamentally shifted. He was no longer Hoste Silas Blackwood, the quiet, 40-year-old virgin rancher. He was a man who had faced his fears, embraced vulnerability, and found connection in the most unexpected of places. As he rode away, back towards the solitude of his ranch, the thought of it no longer felt so daunting. His cabin, once merely a shelter, now held the lingering scent of lilac and the memory of shared intimacy. The silence of the plains, once a reflection of his own inner quietude, now seemed to echo with the soft whispers of discovery. The town, for its part, would continue to whisper about Evelyn Hayes, the independent woman who ran the saloon, and about Silas Blackwood, the reserved rancher. But they knew nothing of the profound, gentle revolution that had unfolded between them, of the quiet courage it had taken for a man who had admitted "she's so hot" to look down in embarrassment, only for the woman to raise his chin with a simple, life-altering request. "Be my first." Their story was not one of scandalous affairs or dramatic declarations, but of two lonely souls finding solace and strength in an unlikely union, redefining what it meant to be experienced, and charting a new horizon in the vast, unforgiving landscape of the Old West. The scars of the past remained, but they were now illuminated by the hopeful glow of a shared future, built not on societal expectations, but on mutual respect, quiet understanding, and the profound bravery of two hearts opening to each other for the very first time.